Are you a player who's tired of fighting your DM's boring and forgettable bosses? Send them this video. Or are you a DM who can't quite get their finger on how to create a boss that stirs up and activates their players? Well, don't worry, I got you. With these 5 steps, which I call the Toriyama method, you'll quickly be creating bosses that will forever have their name sung in your players' halls of fame. Though many skilled writers will use these tools, you don't need to be George R.R. Martin, you don't need to be Tolkien, you don't need to be Matt Mercer. You follow these 5 steps and it will instantly elevate your bosses to legendary status. And the first step is always need to make sure that your villain is present, even if they're not there, and especially when they're not there. Nothing builds up a sense of dread in your player's mind like seeing the effects of the villain long before they ever lay eyes on the villain. And we see this in the Frieza saga. Frieza is actually the very reason that Goku even has the origin story that he has. The fact that Raditz and Vegeta and Bardock even come to Earth is because of Frieza. And that entire saga happens because of a villain that we've never even met or never even seen. And we are showed explicitly and told explicitly throughout that entire saga how strong Frieza is. But then we continuously see these people who claim to be weaker than Frieza whooping up on our heroes like it's easy. And then you start to understand that eventually our heroes are going to have to confront this Frieza person, and even the heroes lament this fact. How are we going to do this? And that already starts to build that sense of dread. And this will actually lead me into my next step. Because yes, you want your villain's evil to be omnipresent, and you want them to probably have something to do with your player character's backstory. And you could be building that sense of dread. You can be showing through the world building why this villain needs to be defeated. Frieza has literally destroyed an entire planet and many planets and displaced many people. And it plans to do the same to Earth probably, and that can't stand. But another way to build up his power, to build up that sense of dread, to show how evil he is through the world building, while also making the villain seem stronger before we ever lay eyes on him, is point number 2. Tough lieutenants. This step is just as important as the first step, because what better way to have your villain being present even when he's not there than to have his lieutenants, his underlings, whooping your player's ass. A tough lieutenant, especially if it's a single person, but a group of people, even like the Ginyu Force, if they are so tough that your party is losing to them, or even if they do win, somebody dies, there's a player death, they're going to feel a sense of dread that is compounded by the fact that you're already showing the evil that the person's done. And now he's got tough lieutenants. How are we ever going to beat Frieza if we can't even beat the Ginyu Force? Before the Z Fighters get a chance to fight Vegeta, they fight the Cybermen. And the Cybermen are ridiculously strong and kill multiple of them. However are we going to beat Vegeta if we can't even beat the Cybermen? And we see this theme repeated throughout Toriyama's work. However are we going to beat Cell when we couldn't even beat 17 and 18? A force so destructive together that Trunks had to go back in time to try to fix the timeline because they destroy the entire world in the future. Cell comes back and eats both of them, no problem. However are we going to beat Cell? Forcing your players to deal with a tough challenge, an underling that still whoops their ass, is going to make your boss feel way more deadly by proxy. And it's that same feeling of dread, that same feeling of awe, that if these minions are so powerful, then what must the boss be like? That feeling is going to build up that sense of legendary status in your player's mind. And the trick is that you don't even have to show your players your villain when you do this. It's actually more effective when you don't. But when you do show your villain, that leads me to my 3rd step. Unique look, or an interesting design. Now, the way that this is going to basically work in D&D is that it's going to come down to your description. Because yeah, they felt his presence, they felt his evil in the background, they fought those tough lieutenants, got their ass whooped, but overcame. And now they have this sense of, oh my gosh, this guy must be really powerful. And when they first lay eyes on him, that moment should be striking. The very first time you see Vegeta, why does this man have a tail? If you have no idea what Dragon Ball is, then you already have that question. If you've read Dragon Ball, then you have even more questions. Because like, why does he have a tail? Like, is he related to Goku? What's going on here? So that's already interesting. When he introduces Majin Buu, like he's like a weird gumdrop jelly man. And it is weird, but it's more than weird, it's unique. Because it fits within that world, it fits within the aesthetic, but it's still unlike anything else we've seen. And that's what you want to focus on with your boss. And I would recommend focusing on your 5 senses. You want to of course, think about what he looks like, and you're going to want to write out a good description. But you're also going to want to focus on the other things. Does he make any unique sounds? In the case of a humanoid, is he saying anything repetitively? Does he have any phrases? When you get close to him, what does the air smell like? Does he give off a pungent odor, or does he give off a fragrance? Maybe that's even more disturbing if the boss smells pleasant. That's an interesting idea. Are there any bad feels, any bad vibes, any sort of arcane energy that he's giving off that your players can sense? I would recommend using Describe. It's great. I have a subscription. No, I'm not sponsored by them, but I do use it. And they have great flavor text that you can basically take the bones of and rearrange. So that way you don't have to write everything from scratch. And as a bonus tip, just remember, size doesn't equal power. A lot of Akira Toriyama's designs, the more powerful his boss gets and the more forms they take, the smaller they get, almost as if their power is becoming more condensed. So a lot of the uniqueness or a lot of the interesting nature of your design can come from the fact that the visual design is juxtaposed to what the players are built up to expect. If you've been building up this huge, evil, malevolent lord who controls all these powerful minions, and then they finally get to the boss, maybe the first time they see them, it actually turns out to be a very young, attractive girl, you know, like the literal opposite of what you would expect in that position. And that will automatically make that villain much more memorable. And so moving on into the next thing, you want to be thinking about the boss's arena. These are the circumstances under which the confrontation takes place. Now is the moment. Now is the time to throw down. What is the actual circumstance of the fight? When you look at Akira Toriyama's fights, a lot of people get caught up in the fact that both characters are, yelling for 2 episodes straight. And usually the person who yells loudest and longest is the strongest one and wins. But when you stop and objectively look at the fights that are taking place, you'll see that they are inherently interesting in of themselves. The entire Saiyan saga, Goku's fighting Raditz, and he's fighting the Cybermen, and he's fighting Vegeta and Bardock. But what's really happening is the Z Fighters are literally fighting off an alien invasion from a probing hostile force. So our very first saga is an alien invasion story, and that's inherently interesting. For the Frieza saga, the entire thing takes place on Namek. Now in D&D terms, going to a different planet is almost akin to going to a different plane or a different realm. The fact that essentially this boss fight takes place on a completely different realm, and that's the first time that we've seen Frieza is in this realm, firmly within his seat of power, and we've never been off Earth before this saga, and that's inherently interesting. Then in the Cell saga, we finally come across Cell, who's eaten 17 and 18. He's achieved his perfect form. When he fights the Z Fighters, it's under threat of destroying the planet. He holds the planet hostage and forces them to have a tournament where they fight him fairly, one-on-one, and then the best man wins. A tournament with the planet being held hostage? That's inherently interesting. In the Boo saga, we have a phase of the boss fight where they literally get absorbed by Boo and have to fight his innards to get out. A boss fight that takes place inside of the boss? That's inherently interesting. And there are so many more examples throughout Dragon Ball Z that we could pick from. And so you want to be cherry picking these ideas even for your own games. Yes, there's no reason why you shouldn't take any of these ideas because they work. And your players will enjoy playing through these different scenarios as much as you'll enjoy building them. And that leads us to our last and final step, and that is power-ups, charge-ups, level-ups. This isn't even my final form. Transformations. This is going to make your boss seem extra legendary, and it's probably what Akira Toriyama is best known for, the fact that his bosses have multiple stages. Now, in D&D, this is going to break down into basically legendary actions, mythic actions, layer actions, and the goal is not to make a long fight. The goal is just to make a fight with multiple phases. And because fights in D&D tend to go pretty quickly, especially if you have a party of 4 to 6 and they're fighting a single villain, and even if he's got a bunch of legendary actions, if they're doing damage every round and he's attacking in between their turns, maybe your combat will last 3 rounds, maybe it'll last 5 rounds. But in that amount of time, you should have multiple phases. And there's a couple different things that can shift phases in the fight, but I like to focus on characters and the environment. 1, the character shifts the fight. That's going to be basically a transformation, like, this isn't my final form. This is incredibly fun for players because as they get to peel back the layers, you as the DM get to show more and more dangerous powers. This method is fun as a DM because for every phase that your characters defeat, you get to pull out something crazier, deadlier, and your players are going to be expecting it. They're going to be loving it. 2, I like to focus on the environment. So that is, the environment is shifting based on the fighting because the fighting has been so intense. Frieza decides to destroy the planet. In that moment, that becomes an environmental phase shift because now the planet is being destroyed and you have to defeat Cell before the planet explodes. So now there's a timer. And any sort of phase shift that adds a timer, That's good game design and is inherently interesting. So if your characters are level 2, level 3, and you want them to have a pretty epic boss fight, but it's small scale because they're pretty weak, then have the environment that you're in be interactable and destructible. Have them be able to knock out walls, knock out support beams, possibly the building starts to topple. And now there's a timer. Now they have to either defeat the boss or get what they're there to get before the whole structure collapses down on top of them. Again, good design and inherently interesting. What I like to personally do is create mythic actions. And these mythic actions are things that only happen if a certain trigger is hit. I have a mythic action that specifies if this boss gets beat in 2 rounds or less of combat, give them all of my party's maximum strength, they are going to break out their ultimate form. And how often do we see that in anime, especially in Dragon Ball Z, where the heroes are winning and the villain just goes, no, I won't let myself lose like this. No, I'm the chosen one. I'm not supposed to go down like this. And then they just turn up the juice. That's gonna make your players feel badass because they're gonna feel like, yeah, we whooped his ass and we pushed him to this. It's one of my favorite mythic actions to do, and I love giving my big bad evil guys at least one extra boss phase that they'll go into before the players get to beat them. I think a lot of the time DMs feel like their bosses get one shot right away, but that is impossible to one shot your boss if they have multiple phases. When this HP bar gets depleted to 0, if that happens in 2 rounds, they're going to have an alternate form. Then that solves that problem. And your players are never going to feel like, oh, we got to the boss. That was pretty easy. No. Because that boss fight is going to have multiple phases. Your boss is going to level up and the environment is going to shift. So that fight is going to have an additional 2 phases. Now, if you want your fight to be relatively short, then you should have those phases shift at the end of every round or at the end of every other round. And then your players can finish off that fight in that last phase. And even if they beat the combat in 3 rounds, it will have shifted in those phases, and they're gonna be like, oh my god, like that was so intense, that was so crazy, man, we were fighting in there and then the ground opened up and there was a volcano and then we beat him down real quick, but then he like hulked up. So you'll be able to make intense, iconic, legendary villains with very little narrative complexity. You don't have to be a master writer. All you need to do is make sure that your villain's evil is there, that they are present, that they are felt even when they're not there, especially when they're not there, that those lieutenants that your players do fight are tough, and that they whoop your players' ass to the point where even when your players win, they're going to wonder, how ever are we going to beat the boss? You want your boss to have that unique look. You can do this at any point throughout the campaign, but it's important that your players don't fight the boss at this point. They just get a look at them. They still need to clear out all of these lieutenants before they get to the boss. And when they finally do, what are the circumstances surrounding that fight? What is the physical location, but then objectively, what are the circumstances surrounding this fight? Is there an alien invasion? Is there some sort of civil war going on in the background? Is there some sort of cataclysmic weather event? Just whatever that you feel like would be interesting. And then finally, the fight itself and your boss in the phases that he takes. You'll have legendary actions, so your boss will be taking movements and attacking and stuff in between players' turns. In between rounds, the phases will be shifting. So even if your players defeat your boss in just 3 rounds, they'll have a multi-phase boss fight that's quick, fast-paced, intense, and epic. And I guarantee you that they'll talk about those fights for years to come. And thinking about the power-ups, I have a quick 6th bonus tip. And that is, don't be afraid to destroy the environment. It's going to make the whole boss fight seem much more epic, because then when the players win, you get to describe the aftermath. You get to describe the craters that were left in the ground, the magma that's spilling up out of the scars that they've left in the earth, the places where the sand has been turned to glass by the fireballs that they've cast. And just go ahead and go in with the descriptions to make sure that the players really feel like that area was fought in. And also, when you have that large scale destruction, it's going to make your players really feel like the boss was fighting to win. And that's also important, because you don't want your victory against your boss to feel cheap, because that will quickly rob them of their legendary status. But that's all I have for you today. Hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. If you want to give us something a little bit sweeter, you'll find a link to the Patreon below. You'll also find the links to the Reddit, where we release announcements and other homebrew things of that nature, and our original art Instagram page, where I do original Dungeons and Dragons art, and I will be having some art live streams coming up soon, where I'll be inking some D&D artwork for you all to view. And if you like live plays, or indeed just want to see me DM and put into practice all the things that I teach here, then tune in for the Great Valley Dragonrider campaign, which is a show that we're releasing every Friday. Tune in for that, and hopefully I'll see you then. But until then, have a good weekend, be safe, and I'll see all of you in the next one.